James Washington, a 32-year-old black tech CEO, stands drenched in first class, his expensive suit ruined by red wine as flight attendant Diana Miller smirks and whispers to her colleague. Fellow passengers gasp as James calmly pulls out his phone and makes a call. "It's done. We've got everything we need," he says cryptically. "By the time this plane lands, no one will believe what's about to happen, least of all Diana Miller, who has no idea she just picked the wrong black man to humiliate." Before we dive into this shocking story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever witnessed unfair treatment on a flight. The way James handles what happens next might just change how you respond to discrimination forever. 3 hours earlier, James Washington stood in front of his penthouse apartment mirror, adjusting his custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. His reflection showed a man who'd fought for every inch of his success. At 32, he was the youngest CEO in the tech security industry and one of the few black faces at industry summits. Meeting documents are uploaded to your secure cloud, called Zoe Brooks, his executive assistant from the living room, where she was organizing his travel details. "And I've confirmed your dinner with Aerotech executives tonight at 7. James nodded, sliding his platinum cufflinks into place, a gift he'd bought himself when Horizon Technologies landed its first $1 million contract. This acquisition could change everything, he said, more to himself than to Zoe. "If Aerotech partners with us, we'll have the resources to scale globally." Zoe handed him his leather portfolio. "They'd be fools not to take our offer. Your security protocol is revolutionary." James smiled, but didn't respond. He'd learned the hard way that in his position, nothing was guaranteed. For 3 years, he'd pitched his company to investors who couldn't see past his skin color. He still remembered one venture capitalist who'd asked if someone else would be the face of the company. The memory still burned. "Car's waiting," Zoe said, breaking his reverie. "Marcus will meet you at the San Francisco office. He's finalizing the presentation now." The drive to LaGuardia was smooth, but James used every minute productively reviewing market projections on his tablet. His company's proprietary security software had caught the attention of several major corporations, including Aerotech, whose executives had finally agreed to discuss acquisition terms. At the airport, James moved efficiently through security, accustomed to the extra random screening that somehow always included him. Today was no different. His briefcase searched his shoes, examined more thoroughly than the white businessman ahead of him. When James reached the gate for National Airlines Flight 657, first-class boarding had already begun. He joined the line, boarding pass in hand. "Sir, this is for first-class passengers," said the gate agent, eyeing his ticket doubtfully. "I'm aware," James replied, evenly sliding his boarding pass across the counter. The agent's eyebrows rose slightly as she scanned it. "Oh, I see. Have a good flight, Mr. Washington." James had long ago stopped reacting to these small indignities. They were as regular as sunrise. Once aboard, James located his seat 3 amperes window. As he placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, a flight attendant with a nameplate reading Diana Miller approached. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone clipped. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Before James could respond, an older white man took the aisle seat beside him. Diana immediately brightened. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome aboard. Can I get you a pre-flight beverage? Perhaps champagne?" The man nodded, and Diana turned back to James, her smile tightening. "And you, sir, are you comfortable with your seat assignment?" James met her eyes directly. "Very comfortable, thank you. I'll take sparkling water." Diana's smile didn't reach her eyes as she nodded and moved away. Across the aisle, James noticed a familiar face. Bradley Thompson, CEO of rival company Securanet. Thompson gave him a calculating look before returning to his phone conversation. James also spotted Sarah Chen, a well-known technology journalist, sitting 2 rows ahead. Interesting, he thought. The industry's key players all on one flight. As other passengers boarded, James observed the flight attendants' interactions. Diana was effusive with white passengers in first class, offering to hang jackets and suggesting cocktails. When she returned with his sparkling water, she placed it on his tray without a word and moved on. James sipped his water and pulled out his phone to text Marcus. On schedule. Thompson is here too. Looks like our intel was right. Marcus replied instantly. Stay sharp. Remember why we're doing this. James put his phone away, his mind drifting to what had led him to this moment. The repeated indignities, the closed doors, the assumptions. He'd built Horizon Technologies, despite it all, creating security software that had made him a millionaire before 30. Yet people like Diana still looked at him and saw someone who didn't belong in first class. As the plane began taxiing, James looked out the window at New York, receding behind them. By the time they returned, everything would change, not just for him, but for countless others who faced the same battles daily. Little did Diana Miller know her routine discrimination was about to backfire in ways no one on this flight could possibly predict. The seatbelt sign had been off for 20 minutes. Diana had already served drinks to every first-class passenger except James. He'd watched her methodical movement through the cabin, the way she leaned in with a warm smile for Bradley Thompson, how she laughed at a joke from the elderly couple in 2B and 2C. Each time she approached his row, something suddenly required her attention elsewhere. A passenger signaled from the back. A colleague needed assistance. She even disappeared into the galley for several minutes, emerging with fresh drinks for everyone but him. James pressed the call button. Diana glanced at the illuminated light above his seat, made brief eye contact, then turned away to arrange snacks on her cart. He pressed it again. This time, a younger flight attendant started toward him, but Diana intercepted her with a whispered comment that made the younger woman glance at James with sudden wariness. Finally, after serving the last white passenger in first class, Diana approached. "Did you need something?" She asked, her tone making clear that whatever he needed was an inconvenience. "I ordered sparkling water before takeoff," James said evenly. "I'd also like to see the wine selection." Diana's smile was tight. "Of course. I must have forgotten." She returned minutes later with a glass of sparkling water, placing it carelessly on his tray before holding out the wine list. "Our red wines today include a Cabernet Sauvignon and a Pinot Noir," she recited mechanically. "I'll try the Cabernet, please," James said. Diana nodded and turned away. From his seat, James could see her in the galley, talking to another flight attendant while glancing back at him. The other attendant covered her mouth to hide a smile. Diana poured red wine into a glass, then started back toward James's seat. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Diana approached his row wine glass in hand. As she extended it toward him, her foot suddenly caught on nothing at all. The glass tipped. Dark red wine cascaded over James's crisp white shirt, designer tie, and charcoal suit. The glass itself clattered onto his tray, splashing even more wine onto his laptop. Several passengers gasped. The white businessman next to James jerked away to protect his own clothing. "Oh, Diana," exclaimed her surprise, sounding rehearsed. "I'm so terribly sorry. How clumsy of me." James sat perfectly still, wine dripping from his saturated clothing. He'd been here before, in restaurants, when servers accidentally dropped food on him in stores, when security followed him so closely they bumped into him at conferences when drinks mysteriously spilled on his presentations. Diana dabbed ineffectually at his suit with a single cocktail napkin, making the stain worse. "These things happen," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Let me get you some club soda for that." As she stepped away, James heard her whisper to the other flight attendant, "Guess he won't be making any big meetings looking like that. Back to economy where he belongs." The attendant stifled a laugh, not realizing James could hear every word. For a brief moment, James felt the familiar surge of anger, the same anger he'd felt when investors questioned his credentials, despite his Harvard MBA, when security guards followed him through his own office building, when homeowners in Reckley, affluent neighborhoods called police as he viewed potential houses. A memory flashed through his mind. His father coming home with coffee spilled accidentally on his medical scrubs by a nurse who didn't believe black men could be surgeons. His father had changed clothes and returned to work without complaint. "Don't let them see they got to you," he'd told James. "That's what they want." But James had learned to channel that anger differently than his father had. His generation had new tools. While Diana was away, James discreetly removed a microfiber cloth from his pocket and dabbed at his laptop. Then he adjusted his tie, specifically the small, almost invisible tie pin that contained a high-definition camera. Finally, he took out his phone and sent a text to Marcus: "Incident in progress, capturing everything." Across the aisle, Bradley Thompson watched with poorly concealed satisfaction. Their companies were competitors for the Aerotech contract after all. James appearing disheveled and wine-stained at the meeting would only help Thompson's chances. Diana returned with club soda and more napkins, making a show of helping while actually doing very little. "These things just happen sometimes," she repeated, with false sympathy. "Yes," James replied, his voice calm. "They do seem to happen quite often to people who look like me." Diana's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're implying, but it was an accident." Of course, James said, his tone neutral but his eyes intent. "Just like it was an accident when you ignored my call button 3 times. And an accident when you asked if I was in the right section while not questioning any other passengers." Diana's face flushed. "I'm just doing my job." "So am I," James replied, using his phone to take photos of his ruined clothing and laptop. "So am I." In the cramped airplane bathroom, James carefully blotted his wine-soaked shirt with dampened paper towels. The expensive Italian fabric was almost certainly ruined, but appearances still mattered. He had packed a spare shirt in his carry-on, thankfully, but wanted to document the damage thoroughly first. Once satisfied with his documentation, James locked the door and pulled out his phone. He called Marcus Jenkins, his chief operating officer and closest friend since their Harvard Business School days. "Marcus, it's happening exactly as we anticipated," James said quietly. "How bad?" Marcus asked. "Red wine, all over everything." "Definitely intentional," James replied, examining his stained suit in the mirror. "She even made a comment about me belonging in economy to another flight attendant." "Got that on audio." There was a low whistle from the other end. "That makes 4 for 4. Every black executive we've sent on national airlines in the past month has experienced similar accidents. Difference is we've got this one documented from multiple angles," James said, adjusting the nearly invisible camera in his tie pin, HD video and audio. "The tie pin is working perfectly." This wasn't just about one ruined suit. For 3 months, Horizon Technologies had been quietly investigating a pattern of discriminatory behavior on national airlines flights. It had started when James's VP of Sales, Tasha Robinson, returned from a business trip, furious, after being repeatedly ignored in first class, then having coffee accidentally spilled on her presentation materials. At first, James had assumed it was an isolated incident, regrettable but not systematic. Then 2 weeks later, his chief financial officer, Darnell Hopkins, experienced almost identical treatment. When James's college friend Ayanna Mensah, CEO of a successful startup, reported the same experience, James recognized a pattern. "Our legal team is standing by," Marcus said. "Tricia says with the documentation we have from the previous incidents, plus what you're gathering now, we have a solid case for systematic discrimination." "This goes deeper than just Diana Miller," James said. "I did some digging after boarding. She's had 3 complaints filed against her for similar behavior toward minority passengers. All were dismissed by management. Because National Airlines doesn't take these complaints seriously, Marcus finished, which is why we're doing this the way we are. Exactly. By the way, Bradley Thompson is on this flight. Sitting right across from me watched the whole incident with a smirk. Thompson from SecureNet. Marcus sounded surprised. What's he doing on your flight to the Aerotech meeting? Competing for the same contract, I assume, James replied. But it's a strange coincidence. No such thing in our business, Marcus said. Stay alert. I'll meet you at the airport in San Francisco with a change of clothes. We'll review the footage before the Aerotech meeting. James ended the call and straightened his tie, ensuring the camera was positioned correctly. What had started as a personal affront had evolved into something much larger, a systematic investigation into discriminatory practices that affected countless travelers who looked like him. James thought back to the 3 other executives from his company who had documented similar experiences. Tasha Robinson had been so upset she'd wanted to file an immediate complaint. James had convinced her to wait to help him build a stronger case that couldn't be dismissed as an isolated incident. Darnell Hopkins had been more resigned, having experienced such treatment throughout his career. Filing complaints just marks you as a troublemaker, he'd said. Nothing ever changes. James was determined to prove him wrong. This wasn't 1995 or even 2005. In 2025, with the right documentation and the right strategy, he could force meaningful change. He changed into his spare shirt and examined his appearance. Not perfect, but presentable. His pants and jacket still showed wine stains, but they were dark enough that the damage wasn't immediately obvious. Before leaving the bathroom, he checked his phone again. A text from his office confirmed, live feed received, quality excellent, all incidents documented. James smiled slightly. Diana Miller and National Airlines had no idea what they had just set in motion. He had built his tech company by anticipating problems and creating innovative solutions. Now he was applying those same skills to a different kind of problem. Returning to his seat, James noted that Bradley Thompson quickly averted his gaze, pretending to be absorbed in his tablet. Diana Miller was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in the galley after her accident. James settled back, opened his laptop, thankfully protected by a liquid-resistant cover, and began typing notes. He wasn't just a victim of discrimination today. He was an investigator gathering evidence for a case that would have ramifications far beyond one ruined suit or one humiliated executive. By the time this flight landed in San Francisco, he would have everything he needed. 30,000 feet above the Midwest, James Washington was rewriting the script. For most of his life, incidents like the wine spilling would play out the same way. Suffer the humiliation, contain the anger, file a complaint that would disappear into administrative purgatory, but not today. "Excuse me, Miss Miller," James called as Diana passed his seat deliberately, avoiding eye contact. "Could I have a moment of your time?" Diana froze clearly, expecting a confrontation. Other passengers glanced up, anticipating drama. "Yes, sir," she replied stiffly, her smile professional but cold. "I wanted to apologize if I seemed upset earlier," James said, his voice warm and conversational. "These things happen, and I know your job is challenging." The confusion on Diana's face was almost comical. This was not the reaction she had expected from a man whose expensive suit she had just ruined. "That's very understanding of you," she managed, suspicion evident in her tone. James gestured to the empty seat beside him. His previous seatmate had moved after the wine incident, claiming he needed more space. "Do you mind? I'd love to hear more about your experience with National Airlines. I'm always curious about different career paths." Diana hesitated, then perched cautiously on the edge of the seat. James noticed several passengers watching their interaction with interest, including Sarah Chen, the tech journalist who had turned around in her seat 2 rows ahead. "How long have you been flying with National?" James asked. 15 years, Diana answered, her guard still up. "Impressive. You must have seen a lot of changes in the industry." As James kept the conversation flowing, his tie-pin camera captured everything. He asked thoughtful questions about airline policies, customer service training, how flight attendants handled difficult situations. Diana gradually relaxed, perhaps believing James was genuinely moving past the incident. It's challenging when certain passengers don't understand how things work in first class, she volunteered after a few minutes, a slight edge to her voice. Some people just aren't used to the environment. I imagine that's true, James replied neutrally. What indicators tell you when someone might be unfamiliar with first class? Diana's expression shifted subtly. Oh, you know, the way they dress, how they speak, their mannerisms. Some people just stand out as not belonging. Interesting. And how would you say I stand out? James asked, his tone still conversational but his eyes intent. Diana flushed. I didn't mean you specifically. It's just a general observation. Of course, James smiled. Just curious about your perspective. By the time Diana excused herself 10 minutes later, she had unwittingly provided several discriminatory comments that James's legal team would find very interesting. His approach had yielded far better results than confrontation would have. As Diana retreated to the galley, Sarah Chen made her way back to James's row. James Washington Wright Horizon Technologies, she asked, extending her hand. Sarah Chen Tech Insights Magazine. Miss Chen, nice to meet you, James, replied, shaking her hand. I've read your work. Sarah glanced at his wine-stained clothing. Couldn't help but notice your interaction with a flight attendant. Not the typical response to having a drink dumped on you. James smiled. Life's too short for typical responses. Mind if I ask what Horizon's CEO is doing on this flight heading to the Aerotech conference? Something like that, James answered non-committally. Sarah's journalistic instincts were clearly activated. Interesting coincidence. Bradley Thompson from SecureNet is also aboard. Your companies are competing for the same Aerotech security contract, right? The tech world is small, James replied. Sarah studied him for a moment. There's more to that wine spill than meets the eye, isn't there? James merely smiled. Enjoy the rest of your flight, Miss Chen. After she returned to her seat, James's phone vibrated with a text from his office. Facial recognition confirms. Thompson has airline board connections. His cousin, Peter Thompson, is National's Director of Operations. The pieces were falling into place. James looked out the window at the clouds below, contemplating his next move. His phone vibrated again, this time a message from Marcus 4. Previous incidents documented and compiled. Clear pattern established. James allowed himself a small smile. The microaggressions and accidents that had followed him and other black executives throughout their careers were about to become very expensive for national airlines. What do you think about James's approach? Would you have handled Diana's discrimination differently? Comment number 1. If you think James's calm, strategic response is better than an immediate confrontation. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination and weren't sure how to respond. Subscribe to see more stories about turning injustice into opportunity. What would you do if you were in James's position? How would you handle someone who's clearly discriminating against you? And what do you think Diana will do when she realizes James isn't the easy target? She thought, the next part of this story takes an unexpected turn that no one on the plane could have predicted. The seatbelt sign dinged off after a patch of turbulence and passengers resumed moving about the cabin. James opened his laptop, careful to angle the screen away from curious eyes. He was no longer focused on the wine stain on his suit. Now he was hunting. The in-flight Wi-Fi premium access for first-class passengers allowed James to conduct the kind of research that Diana Miller never expected a passenger could do mid-flight. His first search was simple: Diana Miller, National Airlines. LinkedIn provided the first breadcrumb. Diana had been with National for 15 years. rising from regular flight attendant to purser on international flights, then mysteriously being demoted back to domestic first-class service 3 years ago. Interesting. James dug deeper, cross-referencing public records and social media. Diana Miller, age 42, resident of Long Island. Brother Thomas Miller worked at. James paused, his finger hovering over the screen. Thomas Miller was vice president of network security at SecureNet, Bradley Thompson's company. Well, well, James murmured, taking a screenshot. He glanced across the aisle where Thompson was working on his laptop, oblivious to James's discovery. A quick text to his research team confirmed his suspicions. Need background on Thomas Miller, VP at SecureNet. Connection to Diana Miller, National Airlines flight attendant. While waiting for a response, James pulled up National Airlines' financial reports. As a publicly traded company, much of their information was available to anyone who knew where to look. The airline had been struggling with 3 consecutive quarters of losses. They desperately needed the positive press and financial boost that would come from a major tech partnership. James's phone vibrated with an incoming message. Confirmed. Thomas Miller is Diana's brother. Started at SecureNet 4 years ago after 12 years at National Airlines corporate IT. The connections were becoming clearer. Diana's brother had moved from National Airlines to SecureNet, and shortly afterward, Diana had been demoted from international routes to domestic. Was there a connection? Another text came through. National Airlines filed 3 EEOC complaints against them in the last 2 years. All settled privately. Details sealed. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission complaints meant discrimination cases from employees. James wondered if Diana's demotion was related to similar behavior toward coworkers. As James continued researching, the plane hit another pocket of turbulence. Passengers gripped their armrests, and flight attendants quickly took their seats. The turbulence forced James into closer proximity with other passengers as everyone braced themselves. When the shaking subsided, James noticed Sarah Chen watching him intently from her seat. The journalist clearly sensed there was more to this story. James gave her a polite nod before returning to his work. His research team sent another update. National Airlines Board of Directors includes Peter Thompson, cousin to Bradley Thompson of SecureNet. Peter oversees flight staff operations and disciplinary actions. The final piece clicked into place. Diana Miller's brother worked for Bradley Thompson. Diana's behavior was protected by Bradley's cousin on the airline's board. It was a tightly woven web of connections that had protected discriminatory behavior while simultaneously giving Thompson's company an edge over competitors. How James thought about it. Black executives from rival companies experiencing accidents before important meetings. Presentations ruined clothing, stained confidence, undermined. It wasn't just racism, it was corporate sabotage disguised as individual bias. Another message from his office: facial recognition from your tie-pin camera matched Diana Miller with security footage from SFO Airport yesterday. She met with Bradley Thompson in the United Lounge for 20 minutes. James glanced across the aisle. Thompson was pretending to be absorbed in his tablet, but James caught him stealing glances in his direction, gauging the damage from the wine incident. James's phone vibrated again with an urgent message. Important National Airlines currently acquisition target for Aerosystems International. Rumors of competing bids from multiple parties. Announcement expected within 72 hours. This changed everything. Aerosystems International was one of the largest aerospace companies in the world. Acquiring National would be a multi-billion-dollar deal, and it explained why Thompson was so interested in undermining competitors. Right now, his company likely had a security contract bid with Aerosystems that depended on his relationship with National. As James processed this information, he heard the pilot's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised of a medical emergency at San Francisco International. We're being diverted to Sacramento for an emergency landing to allow medical personnel to board. We apologize for any inconvenience." Passengers groaned, but James saw an opportunity. Emergency landings often meant staff changes, sometimes even executive presence. He quickly texted Marcus' flight diverted to Sacramento. "Can you reroute to meet me there?" Already on it came the response. Also, research team found something big. National Airlines CEO Wilson Grant is scheduled to board your flight in Sacramento for final leg to SFO. Apparently was already in Sacramento for a meeting. James allowed himself a small smile. Wilson Grant, the CEO who had repeatedly dismissed discrimination complaints and protected problematic employees like Diana Miller, would be on this flight. As the plane began its descent into Sacramento, James noticed Diana Miller watching him nervously from the galley. She had no idea that her accidental wine spill had just accelerated a chain of events that would expose years of systematic discrimination and corporate corruption. Thompson's phone rang, and James overheard fragments of his conversation. "Diverted to Sacramento. Grant boarding here. It need more time. The Washington situation is handled." James closed his laptop. The pieces were all in place now. All he needed was a few minutes with CEO Wilson Grant, and this entire house of cards would collapse. Sacramento International Airport gleamed under the afternoon sun as Flight 657 taxied to a remote gate. Through the window, James could see medical personnel waiting on the tarmac. The cabin buzzed with annoyed passengers calculating delayed connections and interrupted plans. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "we'll be on the ground in Sacramento for approximately 45 minutes while medical staff assist a passenger and we refuel. You're welcome to deplane, but please stay close to the gate area." As passengers unbuckled and reached for overhead bins, James remained seated watching Diana Miller. She had been avoiding his section since their earlier conversation, but now approached with forced professionalism. "Mr. Washington, we've arranged a complimentary premium amenity kit for you due to the, incident earlier." She held out a black leather toiletry bag emblazoned with the National Airlines logo. James looked at the offering, then directly into Diana's eyes. "I prefer justice to free toiletries, Miss Miller, but thank you." Diana's smile faltered. "Sir, it was an accident. These things happen in flight." "They seem to happen with remarkable consistency to certain passengers," James replied evenly. 4 black executives on national flights in the past month. 4 accidents involving spilled drinks. Quita coincidence." The color drained from Diana's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," James said quietly. "I think you also know why your brother Thomas moved from National's IT department to SecureNet 4 years ago, and why you were suddenly demoted from international routes despite 15 years of service." Diana stepped back as if slapped. "How do you? Knowledge is security, Miss Miller. That's what my company specializes in." Before Diana could respond, Bradley Thompson appeared beside her, his expression thunderous. "Washington," he said curtly, a word. James gestured to the empty seat beside him. "By all means." Thompson sat leaning close to speak quietly. "You're making trouble for hard-working people. Diana's just doing her job." "Is her job spilling drinks on competitors before important meetings?" James asked mildly. "Or is that a special assignment from her brother's boss?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "You're imagining conspiracies where there's just an unfortunate accident. An accident coordinated with airport security footage showing you meeting with Diana yesterday. An accident protected by Peter Thompson on National's board. Those are a lot of accidents, Bradley." Other passengers had begun to notice the tense conversation. Several were watching openly now, including a young woman who had been seated in economy, but had come forward during the deplaning announcement. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Thompson hissed. "This is bigger than you and your little startup." "Actually," James countered, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A desperate competitor using family connections to sabotage rivals during the National Airlines acquisition talks." Thompson's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected James to know about the acquisition. "You should back off," Thompson warned. "People like you make trouble claiming discrimination when things don't go your way. Diana could lose her job." "People like me," James repeated, his voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "What exactly do you mean by that, Bradley?" Thompson realized his mistake too late. Several passengers were now openly listening, including Sarah Chen, who had pulled out her phone and appeared to be recording notes. "You know exactly what I mean," Thompson said, standing abruptly. "You're trying to leverage an accident into some kind of discrimination claim. It won't work." James remained seated, perfectly calm. "It's not leveraging when you have evidence, Bradley. It's accountability." As Thompson stormed away, James noticed other passengers exchanging glances. An elderly white woman across the aisle leaned toward him. "I saw what that flight attendant did," she said quietly. "It wasn't an accident. My husband and I have flown first class for 40 years, and I've never seen a drink accidentally spilled like that." A middle-aged black businessman from a few rows back nodded. "Happens more than people realize. Thank you for speaking up." The support from fellow passengers was unexpected but welcome. James nodded his thanks as the cabin continued to empty for the ground stop. As the last passengers deplaned, James remained seated reviewing the documentation on his phone. The evidence was substantial. Video from his tie-pin audio recordings, witness statements from previous incidents, the financial connections between National SecureNet and the pending acquisition. He was so absorbed that he almost missed the distinguished gray-haired man boarding through the front door flanked by airline staff. Wilson Grant, CEO of National Airlines, was exactly as James had seen in photos: tall, imposing, impeccably dressed in a navy suit with the company's gold pin on his lapel. Grant nodded to the flight crew and headed toward the last empty first-class seat directly across from James. As Grant stored his briefcase and settled in, he finally noticed James's wine-stained clothing. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Rough flight?" he asked, his tone suggesting this was merely casual conversation. Illuminating, James replied, "Wilson Grant, correct, CEO of National Airlines." Grant looked surprised but extended his hand. "That's right. And you are?" "James Washington, CEO of Horizon Technologies." Recognition flickered in Grant's eyes. "Ah, the security software company. I've heard good things." "I wish I could say the same about national security protocols," James said evenly, "particularly when it comes to protecting passengers from discrimination and corporate espionage." Grant's friendly demeanor cooled. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Washington." "It comes with serious evidence," James replied, turning his phone to show Grant a compilation of incidents involving black executives on national flights. 4 accidents in 1 month, all targeting executives from companies competing with Bradley Thompson's SecureNet, all protected by your board member, Peter Thompson. All part of a pattern that my legal team has thoroughly documented. Grant's face remained impassive, but James noted the slight tightening around his eyes. "If you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," James interrupted. "I'm stating facts. Facts that would be very interesting to Aerosystems International as they consider acquiring National." That got Grant's full attention. "How do you know about—" "Knowledge is security." James repeated his company's motto. "And right now, Mr. Grant, your company's future is very insecure." From the corner of his eye, James saw Sarah Chen watching their interaction intently. The journalist had not deplaned and was within earshot of their conversation. The pilot announced they would begin boarding for the final leg to San Francisco. As passengers returned to their seats, the tension between James and Grant was palpable. "What exactly do you want?" Washington Grant asked, finally, his voice low. James met his gaze steadily. "I want exactly what your company claims to provide. In its mission statement, equal treatment and respect for all passengers, regardless of race or background. and I want accountability for those who violated that promise." As the plane began filling with returning passengers, including a nervous-looking Diana and a scowling Bradley Thompson, James knew the real confrontation was just beginning. The plane ascended smoothly from Sacramento, beginning the short 30-minute hop to San Francisco. James could feel the tension radiating from both Diana Miller and Bradley Thompson. CEO Wilson Grant sat stone-faced across the aisle, occasionally glancing at his phone as if awaiting important news. James's own phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from Marcus. Emergency landing wasn't medical. It was requested by National Airlines Corporate. Grant needed to intercept the flight. Interesting. The medical emergency had been fabricated to get Grant on the plane. They were taking this seriously. Another message from Marcus followed big news. National Airlines isn't just acquisition target for Aerosystems. Horizon Technologies is on the short list as security provider for the merged company. James nearly dropped his phone. This changed everything. His company wasn't just facing discrimination, they were being systematically undermined before a potential multi-million-dollar contract opportunity. As he processed this information, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Trisha Okonkwo, Horizon's legal counsel. "James, we've found something," Trisha said without preamble when he answered. Diana's brother Thomas didn't leave National Airlines voluntarily 4 years ago. He was forced out after a security breach that was covered up by Peter Thompson. "What kind of breach?" James asked quietly, aware of Grant watching him. "He was caught selling passenger data. The company buried it to avoid a scandal, and SecureNet hired him as a consultant. We think he's still accessing national systems through backdoor access he created before leaving." The pieces clicked together in James's mind. This wasn't just about spilled drinks and undermined presentations. It was corporate espionage at a massive scale. Passenger data flight manifests, corporate client information, all being harvested to give SecureNet an edge with clients and in the acquisition negotiations. As James ended the call, the plane hit turbulence again. Passengers gripped their armrests, and in the momentary chaos, James noticed Bradley Thompson leaning across the aisle to whisper urgently to Grant. James's phone vibrated again, with a message from his security team. Facial recognition at Sacramento Airport shows Diana meeting with an unknown man during the ground stop. Sending image now. The photo showed Diana in an airport corridor with a man James didn't recognize. A moment later, another message arrived. Man identified as Michael Reed, private investigator, previously employed by SecureNet. So they were still plotting even now. James realized they were desperate, which made them dangerous. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and James seized the opportunity. He moved across the aisle to the empty seat beside Grant, who looked startled by his approach. "Mr. Grant," James said quietly, "I think it's time we spoke frankly. This isn't just about discrimination anymore." Grant's expression was guarded. "I'm listening. Your company has a data breach problem that you don't know about." James continued. "Thomas Miller, Diana's brother, created backdoor access to your passenger systems before he was fired. He's been selling your data to SecureNet for years, which is how Thompson knows exactly which competitors are on which flights." Grant's face paled slightly. "That's a serious accusation. One that my security team can prove," James countered. "We've traced the data breaches to specific access points created before Thomas left. Points that are still active and regularly accessed from SecureNet's IP addresses." Grant was silent for a moment, processing. "If this is true, it would tank the Aerosystems acquisition," James finished, "which is exactly why Thompson is so desperate to discredit me and other competitors before the deal is announced." From her position in the galley, Diana was watching their conversation with growing anxiety. Bradley Thompson had moved to a seat where he could overhear them, his face tight with barely concealed fury. James's phone vibrated again. A message from Sarah Chen caught Thompson making call during turbulence. Mentioned, "Washington knows too much. and contingency plan. Be careful. The journalist was clearly putting pieces together herself. James nodded slightly in her direction, acknowledging the warning. Mr. Grant James said, lowering his voice further, in about 20 minutes, we'll land in San Francisco. When we do, you'll be facing a decision. You can either address the discrimination and data breach issues I've uncovered, or you can ignore them and watch your acquisition collapse when I take this evidence public. You would tank a multi-billion-dollar deal over a spilled drink? Grant asked incredulously. No, James replied evenly. I would hold a company accountable for years of systematic discrimination and corporate espionage that happened under your leadership. The spilled drink was just their latest mistake. The pilot announced their initial descent into San Francisco. James returned to his seat, aware of the tension now filling the first-class cabin. Diana was conferring urgently with another flight attendant. Thompson was on his phone, despite the seatbelt sign. Grant was staring out the window, his expression troubled. As the plane banked toward SFO, James's phone lit up with a final message from Marcus security footage uncovered from National Headquarters. Peter Thompson ordered Diana to target you specifically. Called it Operation Turbulence. Full documentation secured. We have everything. James allowed himself a small smile as he put his phone away and prepared for landing. The turbulence ahead wasn't atmospheric, it was the storm about to break when this plane touched down. San Francisco International Airport buzzed with the usual afternoon activity as passengers from Flight 657 streamed into the terminal. James Washington moved with purpose, his wine-stained suit drawing curious glances from travelers. Behind him, Wilson Grant barked orders into his phone while Bradley Thompson huddled with Diana Miller near a service door. Their conversation intense and furtive. James spotted Marcus Jenkins waiting near baggage claim, holding a garment bag. His COO's normally calm demeanor was charged with excitement.
You look like you bathed in Cabernet, Marcus quipped as they shook hands.
Petty discrimination has never been subtle, James replied. Got a change of clothes. Designer suit your preferred brand. And something else you'll want to see. Marcus handed him a tablet as they walked toward the men's room. On screen was footage from National Airlines headquarters Peter Thompson in a private office with Diana Miller pointing to a photo of James. Operation Turbulence was their internal code name, Marcus explained. They've been targeting black executives from competing firms for months. Diana was their point person on flights, but it went all the way up to the board. And the Aerosystems deal, James asked, loosening his wine-stained tie. Announcement expected tomorrow morning. They don't know we're aware of it or that we're on the security provider shortlist. James nodded thoughtfully. Where's our legal team? Waiting in the conference room we booked at the airport Marriott. Tricia has everything prepared, including injunction paperwork if needed. James emerged from the restroom minutes later in a fresh charcoal suit, his stained clothing sealed in an evidence bag. They walked briskly toward the exit, but before they could reach it, Sarah Chen intercepted them. Mr. Washington, she called Sarah Chen Tech Insights. I'd love a comment on what happened on that flight. James smiled politely. Just an unfortunate accident, Miss Chen. An accident that connects to systematic discrimination at National Airlines, Bradley Thompson's corporate espionage, and the pending Aerosystems acquisition, she asked, eyebrows raised. Marcus looked startled, but James remained composed. You've done your homework. It's my job, she replied, holding up her phone. I also recorded Thompson's conversation with Diana after landing. He mentioned something called Operation Turbulence and damage control. Care to enlighten me? Before James could respond, commotion erupted near the baggage claim. Wilson Grant was surrounded by airport security and a woman in a National Airlines executive uniform. Bradley Thompson was being escorted to a private room, protesting loudly. Diana Miller stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Looks like the storm just broke, Marcus murmured. James turned back to Sarah Chen. If you want the full story, meet us at the Marriott in 1 hour. Bring your recorder." As Sarah hurried away, James and Marcus approached the security perimeter. A tall woman in a National Airlines uniform spotted them and broke away from the group. "Mr. Washington, I'm Victoria Reynolds, Chief of Operations for National Airlines," she said, extending her hand. "We need to talk." James shook her hand firmly. "I believe we do, Miss Reynolds." The airport Marriott's largest conference room was packed to capacity 30 minutes later. Victoria Reynolds sat at one end of the table with National's legal counsel. James, Marcus, and Horizon's legal team occupied the other end. Diana Miller sat alone in the middle, looking diminished without her uniform jacket, which security had requested she remove after passengers reported the wine incident. "Let's be clear about what happened today." Victoria began her tone businesslike. A National Airlines employee deliberately discriminated against a passenger apparently as part of a larger corporate espionage operation involving board member Peter Thompson, his cousin Bradley Thompson of SecureNet, and potentially others. Diana stared at the table, saying nothing. "We've reviewed the evidence Mr. Washington provided," Victoria continued, "including footage of 4 separate incidents targeting black executives' documentation of the data breach involving Thomas Miller and communications between Peter Thompson and SecureNet executives." James leaned forward. "Miss Reynolds, this goes beyond today's incident. National Airlines has systematically dismissed discrimination complaints for years. I have documentation of at least 12 cases that were buried by your HR department." Victoria nodded grimly. "We're aware. When Mr. Grant called me from the plane, I initiated an emergency review of our complaint records. What we found was disturbing." The door opened, and Wilson Grant entered, looking haggard. "The Aerosystems representatives are on their way," he said, taking a seat beside Victoria. "They want to hear everything directly." Diana finally spoke, her voice small. "I was just following orders. Peter said certain passengers needed to be discouraged from making connections with potential partners. He said our jobs depended on it." "You deliberately humiliated people because of their race," James said evenly. "It wasn't about race," Diana protested weakly. "It was about competition." "It was about both," James countered. "Thompson used existing bias as cover for corporate sabotage. He knew complaints about discrimination would likely be ignored, as they have been at National for years." The door opened again, and Sarah Chen entered, with 2 people in business attire, representatives from Aerosystems International. The room fell silent as they took seats at the table. "We understand there's been an incident," the woman from Aerosystems said, her expression severe. "More than an incident," James replied. "A systematic operation targeting competitors through racial discrimination and data theft." He nodded to Marcus, who distributed tablets to everyone present. On screen was a comprehensive presentation footage from James's tie-pin camera documentation of previous incidents. Security logs showing unauthorized access to National's passenger databases and internal communications between plans. Peter Thompson and SecureNet executives. "This is Operation Turbulence," James explained. "A coordinated effort to undermine competing technology companies before the Aerosystems acquisition announcement." The Aerosystems representatives examined the evidence in silence. Victoria Reynolds looked increasingly disturbed as she swiped through the documentation. "Mr. Washington," she finally said, "on behalf of National Airlines, I want to offer our deepest apologies. This behavior is inexcusable and does not reflect our company's values." "With respect, Miss Reynolds," James replied, "it absolutely reflects your company's values. Not the ones in your mission statement, but the real values demonstrated by your actions, or lack thereof, when discrimination was reported." The room fell silent again. The male Aerosystems representative cleared his throat. "Mr. Washington, what is it you want from this situation?" A lawsuit could delay our acquisition plans for months, even years. James looked around the room at Diana's defeated posture, at Grant's anxious expression, at the expectant faces of the Aerosystems team. "I don't want a lawsuit," he said finally. "I want change." He opened his briefcase and removed a folder, sliding it across the table. "This is a proposal for a comprehensive anti-discrimination program developed by Horizon Technologies. It includes new training protocols, reporting systems with actual accountability, and third-party oversight of complaint resolution. My company specializes in security, not just digital security, but creating secure environments for everyone." The Aerosystems representatives exchanged glances. "You're proposing we hire you instead of suing us?" Victoria asked incredulously. "I'm proposing you fix your broken system," James corrected. "Whether you hire my company to help is secondary to implementing real change." Grant leaned forward. "And the data breach? The corporate espionage?" "That's for law enforcement," James replied. "I've already provided the evidence to the FBI's Cybercrime Division. Peter Thompson, Bradley Thompson, and Thomas Miller will have to answer for their actions." Sarah Chen was taking notes furiously, clearly recognizing the magnitude of the story unfolding before her. "One more thing," James added. "Diana Miller and any other employees who are following orders need to be given an opportunity for retraining rather than simply being fired. Breaking a toxic culture requires rehabilitation, not just punishment." Diana looked up in surprise. "You'd advocate for her after what she did to you?" Grant asked. "I'm advocating for a solution that creates lasting change," James replied. "Simply firing the most visible offenders won't address the underlying problems." The Aerosystems woman nodded slowly. "Mr. Washington, your approach is unexpected and impressive." The meeting continued for another hour as details were negotiated. By the end, National Airlines had agreed to implement James's anti-discrimination program with oversight from an independent board that included representatives from minority business associations. Aerosystems confirmed they would proceed with the acquisition with additional ethics stipulations in the contract. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Diana approached James hesitantly. "Why didn't you just sue us into oblivion?" she asked quietly. "You had every right to." James thought of his father coming home with stained scrubs of the countless indignities he and other black professionals had endured over the years. "Because this was never about punishment," he said. "It was about creating a world where the next generation doesn't have to face what we did." Sarah Chen approached as Diana walked away. "That was quite a story, Mr. Washington. Mind if I get an exclusive?" James smiled. "On one condition, you tell the whole story, not just the discrimination and corporate intrigue, but the solution we've created together. People need to see that there are better ways forward than just endless conflict." Sarah nodded, understanding the significance of what she'd witnessed. As they left the conference room, Marcus clapped James on the shoulder. "You know, when I saw that wine spill on you, I never imagined it would end like this." "Sometimes justice doesn't look like what you expect," James replied. "Sometimes it's better." 3 months later, James Washington stood at the podium of the International Technology Security Conference, his confident presence commanding the attention of the packed auditorium. Behind him, a digital screen displayed the Horizon Technologies logo, alongside that of National Airlines, an unlikely partnership that had become the talk of the industry. "Security isn't just about protecting data," James began, his voice resonating through the space. "It's about creating environments where everyone feels secure enough to contribute their best work, where arbitrary barriers don't prevent innovation, where talent rises regardless of packaging." In the front row, Marcus Jenkins nodded approvingly beside Victoria Reynolds, who had been promoted to CEO of National Airlines following Wilson Grant's early retirement. Grant had accepted responsibility for the culture that enabled Operation Turbulence, stepping down to allow new leadership to implement reforms. 3 months ago, a flight attendant spilled red wine on my suit. James continued drawing, knowing chuckles from the audience familiar with the now famous incident. It wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of a systematic effort to undermine competitors through racial discrimination and corporate espionage. James clicked to the next slide, showing the comprehensive anti-discrimination program now implemented across national airlines operations. What could have ended in lawsuits and finger-pointing instead became an opportunity for transformation. National Airlines has now trained over 5,000 employees in conscious inclusion practices. Their customer satisfaction ratings have increased 18%. Reports of discriminatory incidents have decreased 72%. Victoria Reynolds stood to applause from the audience. Under her leadership, National had become a case study in corporate reform, with transparent reporting of incidents and measurable improvement metrics published quarterly. The Aerosystems acquisition proceeded as planned. James continued, but with new ethics provisions that have become a model for the industry. And I'm proud to announce that Horizon Technologies' security protocols will protect the merged company's operations worldwide. In the middle of the audience, Sarah Chen sat taking notes. Her exposé on Operation Turbulence had won her a prestigious journalism award and sparked industry-wide conversations about discrimination and corporate accountability. Her follow-up series on companies implementing similar reforms had kept the momentum going. As for the individuals involved, James said, his tone more somber. Peter Thompson and Bradley Thompson face federal charges for corporate espionage and data theft. Thomas Miller has turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. He clicked to a slide showing Diana Miller in a classroom setting. And Diana Miller, after accepting responsibility for her actions, now works with our joint training program, sharing her experience as a cautionary tale and a pathway to change. The transformation in Diana had been remarkable. After initially facing termination, she had accepted James's alternative proposal, working with the new diversity initiative to help other employees recognize and correct biased behaviors. Her first-hand account of how she had rationalized discriminatory actions had proven invaluable in developing effective training protocols. The technologies we develop protect data systems and infrastructure, James said, nearing his conclusion. But our greatest security challenge remains human: how we treat each other. Whether we recognize talent regardless of appearance, whether we create environments where everyone can contribute their best. In the back row, James spotted a familiar face that made him pause momentarily with emotion. His grandmother, Eleanora Washington, now 87, sat watching him with tears of pride in her eyes. It was she who had taught him to fight smart, not angry, after he'd come home from elementary school in tears over a teacher's biased treatment. My grandmother told me something when I was 8 years old, James shared, departing from his prepared remarks. She said, "Justice sometimes arrives in disguise. Your job is to recognize it when it comes knocking." He looked directly at her as he continued. "When that flight attendant spilled wine on me, I could have responded with anger, with a lawsuit, with public shaming. Instead, we created something more lasting, a model for how companies can transform discriminatory cultures into inclusive ones." Victoria Reynolds joined him at the podium for the final announcement. Today, Horizon Technologies and National Airlines are launching the Secure Spaces Initiative, she stated, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping companies implement anti-discrimination programs with real accountability. Because security isn't just technological. It's human. The audience rose in a standing ovation as James and Victoria shook hands. What had begun as a humiliating incident had catalyzed industry-wide change. Minority-owned businesses were receiving unprecedented opportunities in the aviation and technology sectors. Discriminatory incidents were being addressed rather than dismissed. After the presentation, as attendees networked over refreshments, the new flight attendant, who had been on that fateful flight, approached James. "Mr. Washington," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. I witnessed what happened that day and didn't know what to do. Now I've gone through the training and speak up when I see something wrong. You've changed our entire company culture." James smiled. "We changed it together. It takes one person to start, but many to create lasting transformation." As the event wound down, James found a quiet moment with his grandmother, who embraced him with fierce pride. "You did exactly what your grandfather would have done," she said softly. "He always said change doesn't come from fighting the same old battles the same old ways." "I had good teachers," James replied, holding her frail hands in his. Later that evening, as James prepared to board his flight home on National Airlines by choice, his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus' front page of Tech Insights just dropped. Sarah's follow-up story is making waves. James opened the link to find a comprehensive piece titled "The Wine Stain That Changed an Industry," with a subtitle that made him smile: "How One CEO Turned Discrimination into Opportunity." As he settled into his first-class seat, the flight attendant, a young black woman who would have been unlikely in this position before the reforms, welcomed him warmly by name. "It's an honor to have you aboard, Mr. Washington," she said. James nodded his thanks, noticing her professional confidence, the security of knowing she belonged exactly where she was. That, more than any corporate deal or industry award, was the true measure of what they had accomplished. Sometimes justice doesn't look like what you expect. Sometimes it's better. James Washington's story teaches us that true justice often requires strategic thinking rather than reactive emotion. By documenting discrimination systematically and understanding the broader context, James transformed what could have been just another lawsuit into industry-wide reform. His approach reminds us that fighting discrimination effectively means not just addressing individual incidents, but changing the systems that enable them. The story also highlights how racism can be weaponized for corporate advantage, with Thompson using existing biases as cover for sabotage. This intersection of prejudice and profit shows why simply firing individuals rarely solves institutional problems. Perhaps most importantly, James demonstrated that seeking transformation rather than punishment ultimately creates more lasting change. By giving Diana and others a path to redemption through education and accountability, he ensured the solution addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. His grandmother's wisdom, "Fight smart, not angry," proves remarkably effective in a world where traditional confrontation often reinforces rather than resolves conflict. By recognizing when justice arrives in disguise, James seized an opportunity that others might have missed in their righteous anger. Sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't the most obvious one. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you knew how to respond effectively? What strategy from James's approach could you apply in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in the power of strategic thinking over knee-jerk reactions, hit that like button to help this message reach others who need to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about turning adversity into opportunity and breaking cycles of discrimination. Share this video with someone who's fighting their own battles against prejudice. They might find new inspiration in James's approach. Together, we can transform individual incidents into collective progress. Thank you for watching. And remember, your greatest strength isn't just surviving injustice. It's knowing how to transform it into something better.